Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to do something, well, pretty fascinating. We're popping the hood on a highly charged political broadcast from Fox News and deconstructing it piece by piece. Why? Because we want to see exactly how modern political arguments are built and then served up to an audience. Now, to be absolutely clear right off the bat, we're not here to take sides, and we're definitely not here to validate the claims. We're strictly looking at the mechanics of the media narrative itself. We're going to see how the host and their guests use specific quotes, drop survey data, and share ground-level anecdotes to construct a very specific lens on today's political climate.
All right, let's look at our roadmap. We've carved this broadcast up into 4 main themes. First, we'll look at the broadcast's foundational premise, then move into how they highlight political rhetoric, check out the polling data they drop, and finish up with their spotlight on conservative mobilization. Let's jump in.
Starting with Section 1, the broadcast premise and the context of political violence.
The host of the segment, Brian, kicks things off with a massive, immediate claim. He states that in the wake of a third assassination attempt on President Trump, specifically pointing to an event at the White House Correspondents' Association dinner, opposing political rhetoric isn't dialing back at all. Now, this framing is a classic move, and it does something very specific. It instantly cranks the stakes up to 11. It's essentially telling the audience, hey, the words we're about to show you, they aren't just typical political theater. They are matters of immediate physical consequence.
Moving right along to Section 2, highlighting political rhetoric, specifically looking at a media montage.
To back up that intense opening, the segment leans on a tried-and-true media technique, the rapid-fire montage. They play a fast sequence of commentators throwing some seriously intense labels at the former president. We hear things like Mad King behavior, claims that he runs the country like an authoritarian dictator, and even references to a wannabe king. Stacking these clips back to back like this, it essentially creates this overwhelming wall of sound. It audibly and emotionally reinforces the host's point that the rhetoric is escalated and everywhere. Honestly, it's a super efficient way to summarize a whole media landscape in just a matter of seconds.
Then, they immediately pivot from that broad montage to zero in on one highly specific target. They bring up a post on X from the controversial influencer Hassan Piker, where he literally wrote, "If the president doesn't want to be called a Nazi, perhaps he should stop behaving like one." By isolating this single quote, the broadcast gives the viewer a concrete, super digestible example of the exact extreme rhetoric they're talking about. It takes you from a sea of nameless commentators right down to one specific, named influencer.
Right about here is where the guest from the Michael Miller podcast jumps in and totally broadens the scope. He makes the argument that, hey, this kind of talk isn't just coming from online influencers. He specifically calls out elected officials, claiming that heavy hitters like J.B. Pritzker and Gavin Newsom are using essentially the exact same language. And he doesn't stop there. He also points to a recent NPR segment alleging the hosts analyzed a shooter's posts and admitted the rhetoric sounds a lot like us. So by looping in major elected officials and legacy media, the broadcast is aggressively trying to prove that this extreme language is no longer on the fringe, it's totally mainstream.
Okay, on to Section 3, polling on political violence and analyzing the data.
Now here is where the whole segment takes a hard pivot. The guest brings in actual data to try and quantify the cultural mood, pulling from an NCRI survey from last April. He states that following the assassination of Charlie Kirk, 56% of left-leaning respondents, and he makes a point to emphasize just left of center, not radical, would justify the assassination of President Trump. Just think about that number for a second. By bringing in a specific percentage like that, the broadcast is attempting to shift the argument away from just a subjective feeling about media tone into what they present as an objective, alarming reality. It takes this abstract idea of hostile rhetoric and drops a heavy numerical weight right on top of it.
And to really hammer this point home, the guest throws out a pretty striking comparative statistic. He claims that very liberal respondents were 8 times as likely to justify political violence against the right compared to very conservative respondents against the left. In the context of the story they're telling, this stat is precision engineered to highlight a massive partisan divide. It's meant to reinforce their premise that the threat of politically motivated violence is heavily skewed to one side, leaving the audience with a stark sense of statistical imbalance.
Then the host, Brian, jumps back in to back up his guest with even broader polling data. He points out that 2 out of 10 Americans actually agree violence might be needed to save the country. And the kicker? He highlights that this sentiment is actually much higher among younger demographics. Brian wraps up this thought by concluding that between the constant rhetoric and these troubling numbers, he is definitely not optimistic about a quiet year.
This right here is the absolute boiling point of the segment, perfectly tying together those extreme influencer quotes with the hard, cold data of a restless youth demographic.
Finally, let's look at Section 4, the conservative mobilization and the ground-level response.
Now, any compelling media narrative needs a resolution, right? A counterweight to all the doom and gloom. So the guest provides a distinctly upbeat report from the ground. He talks about a recent Turning Point event in Moscow, Idaho, held at the absolute largest venue they could find. And apparently, the demand was so crazy they had to turn over 1,000 people away at the doors. He describes the young crowd that did make it inside as unbelievably dialed in, focused, and totally serious, showing up to support speakers like Erica and Matt Walsh to continue Charlie's work. This story is the emotional antidote for the entire broadcast. After spending all this time painting a really bleak picture of hostile media and scary polling, they offer their viewers a massive beacon of hope, a mobilized, focused grassroots movement pushing back in normal parts of America.
So, having objectively mapped out exactly how this broadcast constructed its narrative, flowing seamlessly from a high-stakes premise through a curated montage of rhetoric into specific survey data and landing on an empowering grassroots story, we really have to step back and look at the bigger picture. Why does deconstructing this actually matter to us? Well, because the way information is structured totally dictates how we feel about our neighbors and our country. When a media segment combines emotional rhetoric with alarming data and then offers up a specific tribal mobilization as the ultimate answer, it creates a remarkably powerful behavioral driver. So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on. When political discourse is systematically framed as an existential, statistically backed conflict, does it merely report on the temperature of the nation, or does it actively turn up the heat? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and always keep questioning how the media you consume is built.